Okay. All right. So, first question is, when and where were you born? And can you describe what your childhood was like growing up?
Yeah, so I was born in central Mexico, in a very rural area. Um, the town that I'm from, we lived like 3 miles away. So I left there when I was 3 years old, so I don't remember much. But the it's a very rural feeling. Like my siblings had to walk 3 miles each way to go to school, and so then really. I would say that led a lot to my parents and my dad specifically looking for work elsewhere. And one of the places that he ended up finding work is in the Central Valley in California. And so he moved to California on his own for a few months. And once he had been established, my mom and my siblings and we migrated. We were one of the lucky folks that were able to migrate with a visa. We migrated with a tourist visa. So we were able to fly. We didn't have the experience that many migrants have of crossing the border, what folks would call undocumented or illegally. And so I was raised in by age 3, I was raised in the Central Valley. We moved around a lot. My dad started working as a ranch hand, so cleaning horse stalls, picking up after the horses, moving and cleaning the horses for horse riders. He always ended up working on horse ranches. And then my mother was a stay-at-home mom, and so taking care of the household, feeding us. I would say I was raised for the first part of my life in a very what folks would consider like a traditional Mexican household, where my father was the only breadwinner outside of the home, and my mother took care of the house. And so, with that and being raised in the country, I would say in my mind, my first memories are idyllic, are of, summer in the Central Valley is so hot in California. And so having an irrigation pool near our house that was used to water all of the vineyards nearby. For us, it was like our own private little lake. We'd swim there. As long as we got all our chores done in the mornings, we were eight. My mom would give us like free time to go and do what we wanted. And I'm the youngest of five children. I have one brother and four others or three sisters. And so, really, for me, I felt like my childhood in that sense of being out in the country, of really not having a worry in my eyes at all. My family was really close. We grew up in that sense. I would say that's what it felt like my childhood was growing up. It wasn't until later when I kind of understood more things, I realized like, oh, it wasn't as idyllic as I imagined. For example, when my parents first moved to the United States and the ranch where my dad worked at, we weren't allowed to be in the same area. So my siblings and I would I would say our sleeping quarters were in one part of the house of the owners of that ranch, and my parents lived in a trailer outside. My dad worked for these people. He took care of their horses. He cleaned the ranch. And my mom, she ended up babysitting, cleaning, cooking for this family of four white Americans. And when my mom was like, I don't like the situation that we're in. It feels very exploitative. I think we should leave. How much money do you have saved up for? To my father, he was like, oh, I don't have any of the money because the owners told us that they would hold on to the money. Back in the days, it was hard to get a bank account when you were undocumented. And so my mom's like, well, ask them for the money. I think we need to leave. And when he went back to ask them for the money that he had, his salary, they had told him, like, oh, you don't have any money. Based on everything that we have provided you, it all adds up to like, we don't owe you anything of you working here 6 months and your wife essentially being like a maid in-house. And they didn't want us to go to school. They tried to get we had visas at that time. They tried to collect our visas. And so for my mom and my dad, it was very this like, I would say like modern day indentured servant scenario where they were doing labor to live in a place, but they didn't get paid or didn't get any salaries. And so they were able to connect with like a far removed cousin who was like, no, you need to get out of that situation. We'll help you all find a better place to live, another place to work. And so they really were one of the first lifelines for us to be able to move out of that type of situation. So again, the contrast of me thinking like, oh, I have such a fun childhood. I live on a ranch. There's horses around, even though I don't ride them. Like, what little kid doesn't want to be like, oh, I'm around horses. But like the contrast of the reality that we were living, I think is a lot to my parents, trying to make sure that we have a really good childhood, even though maybe the situations or the experiences that we had weren't the reality of what we were imagining. Um, Sorry, I'm over here. I have your question, so I'm
No,
reading.
it's all right.
Um, So yeah, so we moved around a lot in the Central Valley, really wherever there was work. And because we lived, all the times that at least I remember where we lived is where my dad worked. If he lost that job, then we would have to up and move houses and move to a different town um, wherever he found work. And as I said, we came in as a tourist visa, and tourist visas last 6 months, and so you're able to renew them every so often. So my mom renewed them. The plan, like many immigrants, was we're going to come to the US, we're going to be here for a bit, but we're going to return. The plan was never, we're going to stay, we're going to build a life here, we're going to go to school here. And so the first 6 months passed, and my mom's like, okay, well, let's extend it for another 6 months. And I think she extended it like 2 or 3 times. And the last time she went to go extend the tourist visa, the person working at that place told her, if you want to stay in the US, I recommend you don't come back to extend the visa because they will deny it to you, and then they will deport you. And so my parents at that point had to make a choice, like, do we move back to Mexico or do we stay here? And of the 5 children that they had, 2 of my siblings have disabilities, and my parents, for many reasons, decided to stay. But one of the reasons they decided to stay was the access to resources, to education that my disabled siblings would have here were not at all compared to the lack of resources that they would have in Mexico. Like most countries, there's a negative perception of folks with disabilities in Mexico. But on top of that, the reality of folks having access to education or having access to jobs and careers is super, super low compared to the federal and state laws that mandate students with disabilities to have access to the same resources. And so, I'm sure a life-changing decision that my parents had to make, their decision to stay here undocumented and not, be able to return to Mexico was very much for not only the whole family's well-being, but the well-being of my siblings. Um, and then I would say at some point, I must have been in like my late years of elementary, my parents got divorced. And so, growing up in a very traditional Mexican household where we're like, oh, only white people get divorced, feeling that we held values very different to like the general American population, I think was a very big turning point for our experiences, that my father left the home. Now my mom had to go out and work, and she hadn't worked in the United States. She didn't really know English well. And so, she became someone that had to work out of the home. We moved into the town. Before, we lived like 15 minutes car drive to the town at ranches, and then we moved into town. And then my mom worked different jobs. One of the main jobs that she had and that she had access to is becoming a house cleaner. So that's the jobs that she did. And on weekends, my sister and I would go with my mom and we'd clean houses since I was in probably late elementary and middle school. That's the work that we would do to support my mom and to support ourselves, being able to survive as a single parent household with 5 children. And so um, I would say in all of that, I still feel that I had a childhood that was like with my siblings, like we were really, as I said, we were really close, so we just made the best of it. I think we're able to create a life and maybe a fantasy of a life that we were living. But I would say in general, I had a really I look back at my childhood and I feel like I had a really idyllic childhood.
Great, thank you. Wyatt, do you want to say hi now that you've joined?
Yeah. Um, Wait, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we can hear you.
Okay, splendid. Hi. Sorry, I just got back from class, and I also I'm pretty sure I'm getting sick, so my
Oh, I'm
voice
sorry to
is
hear that.
kind of cooked right now.
Yeah.
But yeah. What question are we on? Because I know we have
Just the first one. Or we
Yeah,
just
we're on
first
the
one.
we
Okay,
just did the
awesome.
first one. So I think you kind of addressed the describing your family caretakers one. So I was gonna go to the one about if you could describe maybe how your family has shaped your values today and your personality.
Yeah. So I would say my parents are very polar opposites. So for me, it's no surprise now as an adult recognizing why they got a divorce. But I feel like part of it was their values, and in one, my mom is a deeply devout Catholic to this day, and those were the values that we were raised, and we were raised in a very much like um, liberation theology, Catholicism. So very much like the role of us as human beings, the role of the Catholic Church is to support the poor, the marginalized, the unjust. I grew up in the Catholic Church my whole life. I was very much involved when it comes to being in like youth groups, youth summits and conferences. I don't know what it's called in English, but an alcoholita, the people that help the priest during the mass. Um, and so I think those values that my mom really held on to of like supporting the poor, supporting the immigrants, were values that she taught us and it was always held as one of the most important values. I know she was very like community driven in that sense that when we came to the US, but also when my parents divorced, my mom leaned, we had no close family nearby. As I said, we have that one like far removed cousin. But other than that, we were completely by ourselves and they lived hours away. So we really had to lean on our community, and the community that my mother built was the Catholic Church community. So people from different countries, whether it was Central American countries like Honduras or other Mexicans, that those relationships that my mom built became family to us, became the people that we saw on weekends for birthdays. And it was very much a sense of like doing good for others. And my mom was also really involved. I remember like I must have been late elementary school. Like she would go to protests, she would go to organizing meetings. In this biggest city at that time nearby was Sacramento. So I remember going to Sacramento for some like tenants' rights meetings that we would like sit at. My mom also started getting really going into like community college classes and taking English classes. And within those classes, she started like meeting other women and organizing with those women. And I grew up like sitting in the hallway waiting for her to get out of class because she wouldn't leave us at home alone. And so I feel like that really has shaped a part of my values of being, I don't identify as Catholic anymore, but that those values, the Catholic values that she shared are still deeply values that I held into all the way until going to St. Mary's. And even when I was at St. Mary's, um, I think that those aspects of like of liberation theology, sorry, or community driven work. And then on the other side, my father was like a person that always had a book at their bedside. He was always reading, get home after like a really hard day out in the sun. Central Valley summers are like 110-degree weathers, like being all day in the sun and coming home, eating dinner, and then like sitting down and reading a book. And he was really interested in like history books and politic books. So at the dinner table, we always ate together when we all lived together. We never ate by ourselves. And dinner table conversations was the conversations that I feel like white American uh modern pop culture is like, don't talk about religion, don't talk about politics, right? Like that was the opposite for us. Like I remember almost every conversation in our household, and how could it not if we were literally living certain political experiences as undocumented Mexicans, always turned political. And hearing my dad talk about these figures like Che Guevara and Castro, and talking about like a very anti-imperialist lens, his always questioning power and like power in a like larger like systemic institutional sense, I feel like for me also was a really big impact, because when I would go to class and I would hear stories about US history, and I was like, that just doesn't add up with what my dad's saying, right? With what my dad is telling me about US imperialism versus like US charity in Latin America. And so I feel like those two, even though my parents were really opposite in those two senses, I feel like, and I see it in my siblings, I see it in myself, like those values of like questioning power, of pushing up against power, of being of prioritizing intellect, not in an academic way, but as in a like critical thinking way. And then like this idea of like care and love for your community, and what does it mean to build community, and what does it mean to have family that isn't blood, for me have been, I think, the two biggest values that I've been able to move forward with while I'm trying to make sense of who I am as a middle schooler, high schooler, and then into college.
Great. What do you want to start to ask some questions? Yeah.
Ooh, sorry.
Okay.
It's not it's not looking good for me, guys. It's not looking phenomenal for me, but yeah, I could bring up a question.
Sure.
Alrighty. Should I pick from random, or do you think I should just start with the first one?
You can start with the first one. I mean, I'm going to kind of answer the first one a little bit, so maybe you could go deeper into that, or you could jump to the second one. It's up to you.
Awesome. And then for the sake of transcription purposes, I
We're
mean, I know
recording
the
it,
meeting's being
so
recorded. Do we have
yeah.
something for a transcription right now, or do
I'll
we just have the recording?
no, I'll edit it. The recording's on, and I'll edit it later.
Okay, splendid.
Okay.
All right. Well, since you kind of answered it with the first one, we can just go a little bit deeper now. Um, how did your upbringing shape your personality, your values, and your outlook on life? And I also, this is kind of just an addition because you brought it up near the end. Um, how did the dynamics feel when you were working with your mom and your family?
Yeah. So I'll probably get emotional. So just FYI.
Oh, no worries.
Um, so I would say one of the things that you know, growing up in the 90s and the 2000s and the late 2010s, you hear a lot about families talking about like, or undocumented people talking about, I never knew I was undocumented. My parents kind of shielded that from me. I didn't find out I was undocumented until I applied to college, and then I found out I couldn't, or I tried to drive and I find out I couldn't get a license, right? And even though I shared previously, my parents created this very beautiful way to like support us and shield us from kind of like the horrible things in life. They also were really realistic with us. And so it from when I could know, I knew I was undocumented. My parents were very open with we're undocumented and what that meant in the 90s when we were growing up. And I think knowing that we were undocumented, and then on top of that, where we ended up living, we lived in an area that was predominantly white, recognizing racism happening day in and day out, whether to us or to the few other Mexican families that lived in the area. It was something that was talked about, that we had clear ways of noticing the injustices that we were experiencing as undocumented Mexican immigrants. And so growing up, I would say they those things were omnipresent. So back in the day, now undocumented immigrants have access in California to get driver's license, and now the whole Real ID is a whole different conversation. But when I grew up, you couldn't get a driver's license if you were undocumented. Um, so that the true fear of driving, and before there weren't sanctuary laws, before there wasn't any protections for undocumented people within certain towns or counties, as there are today, although things are changing, right? So growing up, we knew that like if you get stopped and you don't have a license, you could possibly be deported. So I just know that every time we drove down the street and we saw the cop, like the deep fear, like and at that point we're really young. I'm in like elementary school, and just being like, oh my God, we're gonna get pulled over. Oh my God. we're gonna get deported is a trauma that, of course, almost 40 now, I still really much hold. And I would also say, like, my parents had the ability, um, systems aren't always clear, and so my parents had the ability to get social security numbers, even though they weren't supposed to work with those social security numbers, and therefore they were able to get driver's licenses. But it was like a weird mess up in the system that a lot of immigrants have faced if they came in the early 90s. But my siblings and I, we had social security numbers, but we weren't able to use those to work or anything. So once my siblings started getting older and started being old enough to drive, it was, I have to drive because I have to go to work, or I have to drive because I have to go to school. But they weren't able, but that fear still sat there and still lingered. I remember every time I saw a cop pulling someone over as a kid, I was like, please don't let them be Mexican. Please don't let them be Mexican, because of the fear that they might be undocumented and they might get pulled over. And I remember as a family, my mom would be like, someone's getting pulled over, start praying. And so just holding on to that of like, I feel like it's extra sensitive because I feel like we thought we had moved from that, with all these sanctuary laws that passed, with being able to get a California license, and now seeing very similar, of course completely different, but very similar sentiments of like, this year and last year, of like, you could just get pulled over for anything, you could get stopped by anyone and they will arrest you and deport you or hold you in detention. And so that was a like everyday reality. The few times that my mom did have to leave us alone because she had to go to work and we got to school, it was like this deep fear that, the average millennial deals with, of like, don't answer the door. But with us, it was like an added layer of like, if you answer the door and it's immigration, they're gonna steal you, and we'll never see each other again. So holding on to that, those experiences were like, they felt so unjust. I was like a straight A student. I did well. My parents made sure to like instill values in us of like not being involved in things that were harmful to our communities, to our society, and still knowing that it didn't matter, that you could be like the straight A student, you could have parents that give back to society, you could have family that just does good. And because of our undocumented status, that like none of it mattered. None of it could matter in an instant. And so I grew up, I think that fear of like, I'm gonna be removed from my family, I'm gonna be removed from my friends, was a fear that I held on to. And again, like, it felt so unjust. It felt like, what am I doing all this work for? Why am I like trying to be a good student? If I might get taken away, or I might not have access to go to college. And so I'm the youngest of five children. Um, and my older siblings, like, they went to school, they graduated high school. And back in the day, there wasn't the AB 540 laws that you could be pay in-state tuition if you're undocumented, as long as you lived here a certain amount of years. And so when my older siblings tried to go to the local community college, they kept on hitting barriers, like they couldn't enroll because they were seen as like international students. They had to pay these outrageous and enormous fees if they did want to go to college. And so for them, like, even if college was a desire, for them it wasn't a possibility. My sister wanted to become a nurse, and she did like internships when she was in high school. She in her internships working at the local hospital, as a student, they had like ROC programs. The nurses were like, oh, you are gifted, you're talented, like you were made to be a nurse. And in the back of her head, knowing like, yeah, like, this is just for play, because once I graduate high school, I won't be able to go to college. I can't get a job as a nurse because I'm undocumented. So I will say, like, those things of like unjust ways the world work, like, not only felt like a personal harm to me, but it felt like this can't be the way the world should be. Everything that they teach about us in school, about the United States, about how we have like opportunities, like as long as you work hard enough and you try hard enough that you could excel, like, it just wasn't it just wasn't comparing to the reality that we lived as undocumented people. I had friends that whole time that never knew I wasn't documented. I think it wasn't until I was documented when I was in college that I was like, oh, by the way, I wasn't documented. But, you know, it wasn't a time that we were like out and proud as folks liked, luckily are nowadays, where they're like, I'm unapologetic about being undocumented. Like in the 90s, that wasn't the norm. It was like, don't tell anyone you're undocumented. Like, don't let anyone know, even if they're your best friends, because you never know what they're going to do with this information, and they're going to like get us deported, and your family's going to end up either separated or having to move back to Mexico, and we won't have access to, your siblings won't have access to an education, those of them that are disabled. And so I will say for me, those early moments in life of just seeing like the utter injustice that my family was going through, that my family in the church were going through. Like there were so many of us that were undocumented. And folks getting pulled over, folks learning about folks getting deported. And then on top of that, like going to school and seeing the ways in which my Chicano classmates were treated, were thought of as criminals, were told that they weren't going to amount to anything. Um, all those things really like just lit a fire in me of like just like this can't be okay. And so I would say like the injustices that I experienced firsthand and the injustices that my community as a whole experienced firsthand really have been I would say like had a deep, of course, impact in how I saw myself, how I saw the world, how I understood the United States as an empire. Um, and it really led to me being like, okay, I could have a critical view of this, and then so what am I going to do about it? Like I'm not just going to critique the system that I see is completely messed up, but like there has to be something that I could do. There has to be a way that I could make changes in my community, because this is not okay. So I would say those just experiences, like everyday life experiences of what it means to be Chicana or Mexicana, as an undocumented person, really shaped the ways that I saw myself, and how I understood the United States specifically, because at that time, like that was my world. Like Mexico was a concept far away from me. My parents talked about it, my family talked about it. They'll tell me stories about when I was little, but I don't remember it. For me, the pure little memories I have are like dreams. As an undocumented person, I didn't get to go back every Christmas like many of my classmates to like experience and like regenerate what it means to be Mexican or Mexican American. And so for me, it was like, I know what life looks like here, and what life looks like here is not the life that I think is fair, and that I think that I should be living, and that I think anyone deserves to be living. And so I think that kind of answers that question.
It does. Thank you so much. We also have our third person here now if we want to do that introduction too. Kevin, if Kevin is muted at the moment. Oh, there we
Hello. Um, I'm Kevin Chiarte. I'm a junior at St. Mary's. I'm a psychology major and an ethnic studies minor. Um, and it's nice to meet you.
Like,
Well, still, thank you so much. That was beautiful to hear and everything. And my questions do pertain to two kind of follow-up-ish
mm,
questions. So, I'll just ask another one right now. Growing up, can you share some of the first experiences you or your family had with social or racial injustice? Some of the defining moments, perhaps?
yeah. Yeah, I would say well, much of what I already said. But then also, and what I shared about was mainly, I would say, like elementary school and into middle school. By the time I was in middle school, there was an organization that still exists today called MECHA, Movimiento Estudiantil Chicanos de Aztlán, that it was like a student club at that time at my middle school, and it was for like folks that were Mexican, Mexican American, Chicano, that were like you're critical of the system and you want to change the system. So join it. So I joined MECHA at that time, and I ended up being a mechista throughout middle school and into high school. I held different positions, whether secretary, treasurer. I think at one point I was a president. Um, and throughout this time, my family was still experiencing racism in the United States. And an added layer to that of being undocumented. And so by the time I was in, I think my junior year of high school, my father remarried. And through that marriage, myself and my sister, 2 years older than I, were able to get residency. But my siblings that were much older had aged out. The process says, as a parent, you can't request a child based after a certain age. If not, it has to be like a 20-year wait, or I don't know how long. My parents submitted it back when I was a junior, and my sister still is on the wait list, right? So those experiences, I would say, of being undocumented held true. But at a certain time, like as an undocumented person, and then a little bit after when I became a resident, like you just kind of accept that that's your daily life. I think what was hard for us to accept is I had family members that were treated differently based on their perceived race or their skin color around the police in the Central Valley. So we grew up, or the most of the time, once we moved around a lot, we ended up moving around a lot in a specific town. And in that town, there was very clear racial differences. I would say the majority of folks are either white or Latino, and then a few folks of other communities. And in middle school, in high school, recognizing the different ways in which students were treated, folks that were encouraged into AP classes versus the folks that were not, was very apparent. I In a class of 30, myself and three other people of color were the only ones in most of our AP classes. And we recognized that, and we addressed it, and we talked about it, and we saw the ways in which our teacher would confuse two of us that look completely different. Like it wasn't important for the teacher to learn the difference between us. We were like the two Mexican girls in those classes, and therefore like we were constantly confused. And so in the school setting, I would say I kept on noticing that happen a lot. I kept on noticing that when I would be in these classes, I was a good writer. I was constantly, since I was young, told I was smart because I was like, quote unquote, a good student. And essentially, like, I'm a people pleaser, So, like, that's what a good student is. Like, you listen to the teacher, and if the teacher says do this, you do it. And if the teacher says don't do that, you don't do it. It has nothing to do with my values and my morals of being a good person. Is literally, I don't want someone mad at me. I don't like that feeling. I don't want the teacher to hate me, so I'm gonna do my homework because I don't want her to hate me, right? Like it has nothing to do that I really liked homework, or it had nothing to do that I was super brilliant or super smart. But because I was a people pleaser and that fit within what the school wanted of me, I ended up being told all the time, like, you're so smart, you're so nice. And I got like really much funneled into like a different pathway than the majority of my friends. The majority of my friends were folks of color, and they were in the, oh, you're not going to graduate. Oh, you're lucky if you don't get pregnant by the time you graduate. Like good luck wanting to go to college. Like that's not for you. Don't go there, right? So I was constantly seeing the different ways in which I was being treated versus the ways my friends were being treated. Also, people are like, oh, you're in the AP classes. The AP classes are so hard. And I was like, the AP classes, compared to what my friends were telling me they were doing in the quote unquote regular classes, I was like, the AP classes are a joke. Like the teacher has us read a book and then do a skit, and we're like having fun. Like y'all writing like 3, 4, 5 essays a month, and we're not doing that. Like the teacher thinks we're so smart that we don't need to do that stuff, right? So like even this idea that somehow I had access to more rigorous education versus my classmates, like that's not a reality. And when I was younger, thanks to being part of MECHA, thanks to like my dad and my parents really having us question institutions and the ways in which we're treated as racialized peoples, I was able to name that and see that. And so then when teachers would be like, "Oh, you're so smart, you're not like them," I'd be like, "Excuse me, I'm exactly like everybody else." Like for you to think that somehow I'm different speaks more to you and your like perceived notions, right? And so through that, and that was experience that I saw at school. Like we were part of the AVID program that I don't know if it still exists, but back in the day it was like to help low income and students of color access college. So I was part of the AVID program. And even there, like all of us would talk about these issues. Most of us were folks of color, poor folks of color, and we would talk about these issues like, hey, did you notice they started passing these rules that you couldn't wear bandanas because they would think it was gang affiliated? And then we started realizing, wait, who are the folks that are allowed to wear bandanas and who are the folks that aren't allowed to wear bandanas? And then we were like, okay, let's do an experiment. We'll have one of our white passing friends wear a black bandana all day and see if they get called into the principal's office. And they wore all day their black bandana hanging out of their back pocket, never got called, interacted with the principal, interacted with the different security guards, went to every single class, and they did not once get called in to the principal's office. And cool, they finished their day with their black bandana. The next day, our darker skin friend, we were like, all right, you were a black bandana. Before first period, they were called into the principal's office, told how they had to not wear that bandana, and it was against school policy because it could be gang affiliated, right? And so all these things I'm noticing of like, okay, this is real life things that are happening to us in school. And then on the other end, my family's constantly stopped by the police. I have my family like for driving and someone thinking that they were gonna rob someone because they were simply driving a like blacked out car. They got like five cop cars surrounding them, pulled them out at gunpoint, made them lay on the ground. Like all this stuff is happening to my family. My dad was a victim of a crime, and instead of like the police like taking care of my dad and making sure that like he had access to resources, making sure that they were investigating fully. They were like, he's a victim of a crime. Oh, is he part of like a cartel? Is he part of the Mexican mafia? And then my dad became the primary suspect of the crime that he was a victim to, right? And so recognizing these supposedly two different institutions, which is the institution of schooling and the institution of policing out in public, I those on top of like being undocumented and everything I talked about earlier, for me really stood out like these injustices are definitely based on race. These injustices and the way my dad is treated versus he was married at that time to a white woman. Like she was told, hey, we could take care of you. You know, Mexican men lie. Are you sure your husband's not lying to you? Like those ways in which race was so blatantly used to discriminate against my family, against my friends, against me, really defined like me going into St. Mary's with all these things already in my head. Like St. Mary's did an amazing job of like supporting me and like pushing my critical thinking a lot further and like, having me surround myself with people I had never before. But that buildup of like stuff isn't right. I see this every day. No one could gaslight me to tell me this isn't racism. No one could gaslight me to tell me this isn't sexism or this isn't X, Y, and Z. Really impacted like, okay, what am I going to do now that I have a valid social security number, now that I have a permanent green card? What am I going to do with my college education? What am I going to do now that I am one of two that have access to college when my three other siblings didn't have access, and still don't have access to college because they're undocumented? So I would say those are the things that really I would started forming and having like a deep conscientious into me. Of course, now 20 plus years later are still like really vivid memories for me.
Well, thank you so much. That was perfect. Awesome. You kind of answered a little bit for one of my other questions as well. So, I mean, does Kevin, do you want to take over, do some questions?
Yes, I'll take over. On the topic of like the reason why you chose to go to college, what was like specific things why you chose St. Mary's, and what was the decision process like?
Yeah. So I think if those of y'all were present in that like first meeting we had, and I joked, I'm like the parties were a really big thing. I'm not gonna lie. Like having my sister um became a permanent resident her senior year when like you had already applied to colleges. So most colleges either denied my sister or told my sister, hey, you have to pay thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to go to college because you're considered an out-of-state resident. You cannot, and I don't think my sister even knew about AB 540, though at that time it already existed. So just going to college for her was like UCs or CSUs was not a thing. And because St. Mary's, if I remember correctly, at that time had like a later like acceptance period, she was able to like say yes to St. Mary's when she got her residency. And so that's the reason she chose to go to St. Mary's. And I say that because she's a big reason that I decided to go to St. Mary's, going to see like going to visit her, going to drop her off on weekends with my parents, going and spending the weekends with her. I was like, oh, I really like this environment. The people seem really chill. Of course, it's a beautiful campus. I like that small college feel. And I had been accepted into a few schools, but the one I was really thinking about, I think at that time, was San Diego State. So I was in between those two schools. I loved Stanislaus. We went to go tour it, and I fell in love with Stanislaus. I felt at home in Stanislaus. I feel like I showed up, and I don't know how to explain it, but just my soul felt like, oh my God, I love this campus. And the reasons I didn't choose Sac State, UC Davis, Stanislaus, San Diego State was because I was part of the AVID program. And again, like since I was young, it was always pushed like, you're so smart, you have to go to college. You're so smart, you're like almost a straight A student. I think I was like 3.8 student like throughout middle school and high school. I'm part of AP classes. I do all these like extra academic activities. I'm involved in my community. I do a lot of volunteer work, right? So like I'm setting myself up the way that I was taught to set myself up to go to college. And then all of a sudden, we had to choose what college we had to go to. And the AVID program did a really great job of encouraging us to go to college, but it also kind of instilled in me, like, you've worked this hard and you're going to go to state school. You've worked this hard and you're going to go to community college. You've worked this hard and you're going to go to UC Davis that's down the street. Like everyone goes to UC Davis, right? It instilled almost a sense of like superiority in me that like I can't have done all this work just to go to X, Y, and Z school. So it really, I say, now that I have the capacity to look back, I really think they messed me up in that way. Like they should have encouraged me to go to community college. I should have gone to community college and then transferred to St. Mary's if I wanted to, or transferred somewhere else that I felt home, right? But instead, because of this like complex I felt in my head about like, you haven't done all this work, you haven't had access to all these opportunities to choose X, Y, and Z school, it was like, well, I guess St. Mary's is it. I didn't apply to like Berkeley. I didn't apply to like Stanford. I didn't apply to any of these schools because of like a deep fear that I wouldn't be accepted. And then people would know I'm not as smart as I thought I was, or they thought I was. So I applied to St. Mary's, and when the decision came, it really was a decision based on like this weird superiority complex that I accepted, that was like told on us through the AVID program. And it was like so and so got accepted to school, and like they'd get like, oh my God, you got accepted to that school, and it'd be like so and so got accepted to Sac State, and everyone would be like, cool, whatever, no one cares about Sac State, right? So these really messed up ways in which these programs that are supposed to encourage us to go to college mess with my head so much that I would say was the primary reason I accepted St. Mary's over any other college. Along with like my sister was already there. I liked St. Mary's. I didn't not like it, but again, like financially it didn't make sense for me to go at that time. I like every year had to try to find a loan to pay for St. Mary's. It wasn't, I would say, as like obviously completely looking back now, like it wasn't the best choice that I should have made at that time as an like 17-year-old, 18-year-old making that decision. But that ultimately is what my decision process was like. And also I was like, it's a small school. I didn't like UC Davis because UC Davis, it just felt too overwhelming, too big. And I like that small school feeling. I like the feeling that like I know folks, I don't feel overwhelmed, I don't feel anxious. Excuse me. And so I would say that ultimately knowing that my sister was there, knowing that my sister could support and guide me, And then again, having this weird superiority complex that I felt at that time, was one of the reasons that I chose to go to St. Mary's.
Thank you. Um, to follow up, I want to highlight more the experience at St. Mary's. Like for me, like currently, what I see is a predominant white school. Was it also a predominant white school? If yes, was it easy to still have your identity on campus?
Yeah, I think from what I know, St. Mary's has been pretty much the same since I went there. I don't know what the exact demographics are, but it is a predominantly white, I would say middle class school. And so um going going to a school that was mainly white for me wasn't a huge like culture clash because again, the town I grew up with, it felt like it was like half white and half Mexican. So, and then I was in the classes that I was in was predominantly white classes. And so I didn't really, that really didn't come to a huge shock to me. What came to a huge shock to me is that most people in my hometown were like middle class, if not poor, like everyone, even if they were white. Um, and here, like accessing folks that had the amount of money that I didn't know existed in the world, I feel like that was the biggest culture shock for me. Of just hearing stories my classmates would talk about of having access to money. Like for me, it was backwards. Sometimes I'd get my financial aid check and my family would be like, "Hey, we don't have enough money to buy food. Like, could you share like 200 bucks of that check?" And I'd be like, "Of course, like whatever I could do to support." I started working, I'd be like, let me know if y'all need money. And sometimes they'd help me when I needed money and I'd help them, right? So it wasn't like, hey, daddy, I need X, Y, and Z. I want to buy some new shoes or some new boots. Um, so I also like in high school was very much like a defiant person in the sense that I was like, being in these AP classes isn't going to define who I am. So I'd still show up how I showed up. I'd still wear my big hoop earrings. I'd still speak the way I spoke. I still spoke in Spanish. If I could do a project in Spanish, I'd do my project in Spanish. Like I had no qualms of like reminding folks like this is who I am. I'm not going to change who I am just because the institution expects me to like look a certain way because I'm in these AP classes or for these advanced courses. And so I think I brought that feeling very much to St. Mary's, where I was like, I'm intentionally not gonna let St. Mary's change me. Did that happen? No, of course St. Mary's changed me. Of course St. Mary's had deep impact in the way I maneuvered. But I was conscious of a lot of what it meant to be a person of color in predominantly white spaces. I feel like because of my childhood, um, I was naming racism, I was naming sexism, I was naming all these things. Um, and luckily, I had the language to address it so that when people would do certain things, I'd bring it up and I'd call it out. And I think the most important thing for me is I found a dope community at St. Mary's. Like, yeah, we were a few Latinos there, but the few of us that were there, we were like tight. We supported each other. I mean, we partied together. And as I said in that meeting, like the partying together, the hanging out together, the spending late nights and going driving and going to someone's house and staying there the whole night talking and hanging out, like that really, I think provided a sense of care that otherwise, if I didn't have that at St. Mary's, I think I would have hated my experience more so. I think I would have chosen to leave St. Mary's instead of fighting to try to get a loan every year to stay at St. Mary's because I had a community, I had professors that deeply cared for me and that I felt like this is my family, these are the people I'm going to ride with for the rest of my life. And so I would say um, it it like the reason we started organizing is because yes, it was still deeply racist. Like it just because I didn't have that culture shock of being in predominantly white classes didn't change the fact that like I recognized why I wasn't a predominantly white classes for a school that was a private school that cost a certain amount that was in a certain area, right? So I hope does that answer your question, Kevin?
Yes. Um, with the experiences you have like growing up and like with St. Mary's, is there any like viewpoints that has shifted from when you were a child, and like what were certain things that influences those shift in viewpoints?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing that changed for me, I would say like easily to point and name, is I went into St. Mary's being Catholic and I left being atheist. And that doesn't define who I am now. I've changed my views, but at that time, um, it deeply, that's why I say like St. Mary's deeply impacted me, because it's one thing hearing my dad talk about certain things and hearing it in household get-togethers, about US imperialism, hear about folks that he was talking about, or like Salvador Allende and all these folks that I was like, oh yeah, my dad, he's also like kind of eccentric dude. Um, but then being in classes where this is like academic thought and factual information, for me really started making me question like, wait, all the things that I thought before maybe aren't adding up. Wait, when we talk about power and what power looks like, specifically within the Catholic Church, and when we talk about the colonization of folks in the Americas, things started being like, wait, like it's just not making sense to me anymore. It's not making sense to me that I'm like tied to a religion that technically isn't my culture and my heritage is religion. It doesn't make sense that this institution as a religion has created so much harm, and yet I'm supposed to be deeply devout to it, right? So for me, um, it really did impact, I would say, some of those really core beliefs that I held. Like I went into St. Mary's, like being a leader in the church youth group. In the Central Valley, there's like a central, like every year we would host like 200 plus students for like a weekend retreat. Like I would leave St. Mary's when I first started there to go to those retreats and help lead them. I was really involved in that way. And then having access just to different people, I think. I went into St. Mary's deeply homophobic. I remember fighting with my one of my roommates to be like, no, homophobia, 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 right? And then having access to like be around people and being like, wait, everything that I was told again isn't adding up. Wait, your experience as like being a marginalized person, prosecuted for being who you are, sounds real similar to my experience of being undocumented and being a Mexican. And so I do think having that access to community, having access to education, like learning about things that really, I think those two things are when I went to St. Mary's, completely changed. In the sense that I could, it's an, something that I could point to be like, I didn't think this anymore. Like, of course, there was other ways in which I grew that aren't as easy to identify, but I would say those two things, um, because of those two things, like I am not who I am today if I would have still been Catholic, after St. Mary's, and if I still would have been homophobic, after St. Mary's, and proudly and outly homophobic to that.
Thank you. Um, my last question is basically I just wanted to come from you. Like, what are certain things that you want to share about specifically yourself, St. Mary's, or like your identity as a person in this community? And like a follow-up question after that is like, what are areas of St. Mary's that you recommend people of color to check out?
Yeah. I'm trying to think, for your first question, anything else? I will say, I think Kevin, one of your first questions was kind of like, what are some dreams or aspirations I had as a child? Like, as a child, I didn't have the aspiration of like fighting social justice, right? Like, as a child, I saw injustice. As a child, I saw like messed up things in my community, but that was never my goal. I always like, I first wanted to be an ice skater because there was like a very famous Mexican telenovela called Agujetas de Color de Rosa, and the protagonist was this ice skater. So I was like, that's gonna be me. But then when I went to college, I thought like, I want to be a marine biologist. Like that is literally what I love. I love animals. I love the ocean. I love science. I was super like called to study in that way. I was pretty good at math, even though like I had to sit with it and I still had to do it on paper, but I felt like math made sense in my head and I enjoyed math problems. And so when I was younger, I think since middle school up until my senior year, I was like, I'm gonna be a marine biologist. That's what I'm gonna focus on. I applied to a lot of colleges as a marine biologist. Um, my grandma, every time she would have the opportunity to come visit us from Mexico, she would always bring me little dolphin things. And I had this whole collection of dolphins because, like most millennial Lisa Frank girls growing up, like dolphins was one of my favorite animals. And so I had that aspiration that like I'm gonna work in the ocean. I loved watching those documentaries about like ocean life. I saw myself like living, I don't know, in a tropical place. Um, um, Being friends with dolphins and with all the cute little tropical fish and like caring for and learning about the vast unknown that is the ocean, right? And so I feel like those aspirations, I think, could have been supported more like societally. Um, but because of my lived experiences, because I like what I've gone through and because of the deep sense of injustice that I felt, I decided like to go the anthropology way, that I'm like, wait, there's some questions that I'm not able to answer about my own experience that I want to answer, that I want to understand why culturally, like as a whole, the US hates Mexicans or Mexican Americans or Chicanos, or why do Mexicans, which are my family, don't want me to associate myself with Mexican Americans or Chicanos. Like what is it about these values? Like how is it that we hold these values? How is it that we understand culture? All these things that I feel like were unanswered questions that I had about my own experience and my family's experience was what led me to choose like anthropology over marine biology. But I think if I would have lived in a world where I didn't feel that sense of injustice, where I didn't experience racism on a daily, or my family didn't experience racism on a daily, that I might have not gone that route. If I would have seen myself and my community deeply cared for and supported, I would have had the opportunity to like see myself beyond what my life experiences led me to. And so I really think, there's a popular quote about like, I fight injustice now because I feel like it is my responsibility. It is something that I care for, that I hold deep in my heart. But what would it look like to live in a world where like that didn't have to be who I was? Would I be an artist? Would I be a scientist? Like who would I be if it weren't for those deep, horrible experiences that I had as a child, living in the United States as a racialized person? And so um, ultimately, I chose the anthropology route. I ended up getting a master's degree in Chicano Studies. I love the work that I currently do. And again, like I know that I chose these roles and these places because of my own personal pain. And so I always think about like, how could we create a world where people could really actually tap into their deep sense of like wonder and awe, instead of feeling a responsibility because if no one else is going to do it, like I'm definitely going to be the one doing it, you know?
Thank you. And then my final question is, what are things you recommend for St. Mary's students? Like, what areas on campus are good to check out? What certain activities are good to do? Or maybe go outside of campus activities. Like, what do you recommend? What do you want to inspire with the kids now at St. Mary's?
Yeah, I feel like that's a really hard question, given I did graduate from St. Mary's in 2010, and so I don't know how much St. Mary's has changed. I will say in my time there, like Silsa, I worked in Silsa, I think since freshman year up until senior year. I think Silsa gave me the tools to end up doing what I ended up doing. Like Silsa is like, sure, you're learning all this stuff in class, but like, what now? It's cool to be like brain smart. It's cool to know all these facts about history. It's cool to be able to identify racism. It's cool to do X, Y, and Z. So what do you do with it? How do you actually work within the community and support the community? At that time, I had my supervisor named Ryan. Um, and this man was like the most amazing supervisor I've ever had. Like he'll be like, look, this is what I want to do. And then we'd be like, well, what about this? And he'd be like, you know what? I'm gonna take it into consideration. And the next week he'd be like, actually, I don't think that's a good idea. Or he'd be like, you know what? Yes, go ahead and do that. I think like that's the whole core of SILSA of like head, hands, and heart of like doing the work. And he really did allow me to explore my own sense of what like social justice looked like lived, right? He didn't say like this is what this nonprofit thinks you should be doing, and this is what they think that X, Y, and Z is when it comes to serving folks of color or serving the poor. But he really was like, yeah, Malena, all these questions you have, like ask those questions, push further. What do you want to do? Okay, how could we make sure SILSA is supporting you in the work that you're doing and how you're pushing the college forward or how you're supporting? And so for me, SILSA actually became one of the places where we all organized into that next time that we'll talk about um, the our struggle protest that we had. But it really was a place where like so many of us, because we were federal work studies, so meaning we were poor, most of us were brown or black, we worked at and we started talking about, we had a shared sense of wanting justice. Like everyone that worked in SILSA felt like we want justice and what does it look like? And in that organizing, in that doing that work in SILSA, we were able to come together. So I would say, as I know it still exists, I know that Ryan isn't there anymore, but if SILSA is still that, if SILSA is really about supporting students, really look at what justice lives means lived, sorry. That's one of the first places. I had a job all 4 years that was able to like give me even a little bit to sustain myself. And then when I worked in SILSA, I worked out in the community, and I think for me that was really important because when you live on campus, for those of you that do, I know not everyone does, but for me, I lived on campus, I went to school, like I could make St. Mary's my bubble. I could easily spend, if I don't go home, the whole month at St. Mary's and think like this is the world. Um, and I think that is the reality for most non-transfer students, that it really feels like everything and everyone and anything that's important is happening in those few acres that is St. Mary's. And being able to, at that time, I didn't drive and I didn't have a driver's license, but I would take the bus, I would take BART to go work at the Leo Center in Oakland, like recognizing like there's a whole ass world out here of folks that like need me to step up and do better. People that challenge me, that I'm seeing how a nonprofit works and do I agree with it? Do not agree with it? What are the issues that I'm finding in this nonprofit? How am I working with the students? What am I learning about myself and about the students and about the community that otherwise, if I was stuck at Moraga the whole time, I wouldn't have the ability to really support and really do. So I do think, I think, you know, you prompted that, Kevin, by saying like, or outside, like if you live on campus, make sure that you find a way to get involved in the larger Bay Area community and not just be involved in St. Mary's as a whole. And then third, I would say is making sure that you're finding your community. Like for some folks, it was mission and ministry. For us, it was salsa. For some folks, it was the parties on the weekends or whatnot. But finding the folks that you're like, I have relatively similar shared values to these folks. I feel myself heard and challenged. I think is important because I was constantly challenged to rethink the ways I thought about stuff. And if I only hung out with people that thought exactly like me, I would have not been able to grow. And so being able to meet people from different areas, and I think it was just like that's how life was. There were so many little folks of color at St. Mary's that we all gravitated to each other. So I met folks that were from Samoa, and I was like, dang, I'm so ignorant. I didn't even know that was a country. Like I didn't know that was a place. Now I'm meeting someone from a place I didn't even know at that time that existed, right? And it just so haphazardly, like, you're folks of color, we're folks of color. We all kind of hang around, we party together, and in that relationship building that might feel like very childish was actually not, was ways in which we were bonding with one another. possibly not the healthiest ways we were bonding with one another, but it still created that community for us that I felt I wasn't alone, that I felt people had shared experiences that when I told them like, oh my God, could you believe what this person said in class? They said this wild racist thing, X, Y, and Z. I didn't have folks gaslighting me about my experience. And they were like, oh my God, they said the same thing. And what about this? And in those conversations of like, I need to tell someone this is like wild stuff happening here. As opposed to I couldn't call my friends up that weren't at St. Mary's and be like, this happened at St. Mary's. They were like, okay, what did you expect? It's a freaking Catholic private school. Like you thought it was going to be super radical. So being able to have those people at St. Mary's that understand like it's a very unique experience there, for me made a difference. So with all those then three things, being able to put them together, I think is what prompted my personal growth, but also my involvement in organizing there at St. Mary's.
Thank you. I'm gonna open up the questions for other people. Hayden, I think you have a question.
Well, I kind of wanted to I wanted to first of all, really I appreciate you talking about like how small the community at St. Mary's can get. It's even smaller now
Is
because
it really?
yeah, we're only like I think we only have like 2,000 undergrads. Like
Yeah, I
it's
think we were 3,000 when we were
yeah,
there.
it's been declining. And so I very much appreciate you bringing that up because it is a very small, and I feel sometimes with people around here, it's like I live in this world and I never go outside. It's like
Right.
this is not the real world.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then you mentioned Salsa too. I know Salsa, it is still around. They've reduced a lot of their stuff
Mhm.
because of they had like Jumpstart
Yeah,
under there and stuff, and they reduced a lot of it because of the federal funding cuts.
makes sense.
Yeah, but it is still around. Yeah, did you guys have any other questions or did you want to add anything more for this portion of it?
Not that I could think of.
Okay.
I'm
Kevin,
trying to think.
Wyatt?
I mean, I feel like y'all's questions were pretty thorough in making me think about like actually I do want to add one thing about
Sure.
my childhood. And I mentioned it briefly, but I think it's an important topic and maybe just because I'm a Chicano studies that it's an important topic for me, but um I grew up in a household that very much like we had deep pride in our Mexican identity. My parents are like, never call yourself Mexican American, you are Mexican. And when I first grew up hearing that, I was like, oh yeah, because I'm proud of being Mexican, because there's pride in like that's where I was born, that's where my family's been for centuries. Like, yes, I'm Mexican. And then later in life, I started realizing like, oh no, it's that. And it's also because my parents have negative feelings about Mexican Americans, right? And so this belief that like you're different than them, I saw it at school, but then I also saw it at home. At home, my parents are like, oh, those Mexican Americans, like if we only had their opportunities, and I heard it from like my immediate family, but also my extended family, like, dude, if I was born in the US, I wouldn't be messing my life up. I wouldn't be in gangs. If I were born in the US and I had a social security number and I was a citizen, oh, I'd be like running the world, right? Like these feelings that it like that Mexican Americans and Chicanos specifically are choosing not to access resources, are choosing because they're lazy, whatever it is that these ideas and stereotypes are of Chicanos, really impacted me when I was growing up. Because again, I was like, well, what you're telling me at home isn't making sense because all my friends are Chicano. I'm one of the few born in Mexico folks, right? And I see their struggles, I see what they're going through. But I didn't have at that point the language to name seeing what they were going through. Seeing like the disillusionment of these institutions that we did get that promise as immigrants. Like if you're born here and you work hard, cool. And then there's generations that are like, well, I was born here, my parents work hard, and I don't see shit changing for them any different than folks that are undocumented. Like I still get treated the same regardless if I'm a US citizen or not, right? So for me growing up, I really did, as amazing as my parents were in a lot of senses, one of the critiques is they bought into the we're not like those other folks that are citizens and that are spoiling or throwing away their opportunities. You know, there is research that shows like immigrants tend to have higher academic achievements versus second generation and so on. And so for me, that really that had a huge impact on like I would say my embarrassment, like maybe not embarrassment or like my shame of like when I was like, but I want to study Chicano studies because you could say that's not my experience all you want, but I got here when I was 3 years old. Like I wasn't like 20 when I got here. My experience 100% has been a Chicano experience, like being almost born here, raised here, having opportunities that maybe my cousins don't have, but then experiencing racism. And I don't think my parents get that part. I don't think my parents get like the deep trauma generationally of living in the United States, like whether you're a citizen or not. And so for me, like joining MECHA, my parents are like, you joined MECHA? Like, isn't MECHA for Chicanos or Mexican Americans? Like, and I was like, yeah, but like they're talking about stuff that like for me makes sense in my head. That like maybe it's not 100% my lived experience. But it is adding up. And so going to college and thinking about like the Chicano experience, and then even like I identified always as Mexican, and then at one point I was like, no, but I am Chicana. Like that's who I am. Like it is a political identity. It is an identity that allows me to like claim and root myself in a beautiful struggle of what it means to be a person of color in the US because I don't know what it's like to be Mexican in Mexico. I have 3 years of experience or like a tiny bit less than 3 years of experience in that. And I was like an infant and a toddler. So my experience, my full lived reality is what is it to be a racialized person, specifically of Mexican or Mexican descent in the United States, and how am I part of that lineage? So both I could hold a lineage politically and a lineage like um oh my God, I can't think of the word blood. Sanguinely, I think is the word. Um, and so for me, I think that was a really important aspect of being able, before I went to St. Mary's, to like feel a deep sense of pride in being Chicana, because it really allowed me to break out of like a box that my family and that society had put me in, of what they expected of me or how they expected me to show up and present myself to the world. And so I just really want to note that because I think as someone that like I could claim I'm Mexican because I was born in Mexico, right? Sometimes we don't look at what it means to be an immigrant versus a first generation and a second generation. And just because I wasn't documented and I held onto that deep fear didn't mean that I had any more trauma or less trauma than someone that was born here and wasn't undocumented, but still lived in a constant like police state that is the United States.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording and then I'll tell you what we're gonna do.